Welcome to TaiwanTalks, bringing you a Taiwan perspective on global affairs. I'm Albert Chiu. After U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's recent visit to China, did the visit signal rewarming of the U.S. China relationship, especially following the Chinese civilians' balloon over U.S. territory instance earlier this year? Or have their ideological differences widened with each interaction, driving them further apart? The dynamics remain complex and demand careful consideration. Joining us today are William Stanton, former American Institute in Taiwan, Director, National Zhengzhi University Chair, Professor; Tony Hu, former U.S. Department of Defense Senior Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia; and finally, Yung-ming, Tunghai University Department of Political Science, Associate Professor. Very warm welcome to all on the show. Let's take a look at this photo. Early June, Beijing deadlined a meeting with top U.S. defense officials at the Shangri-La Security Conference hosted in Singapore due to ongoing U.S. sanctions on China's Minister of Defense Li Shangfu. During Blinken's meeting with President Xi, she sat alone at the head of a U-shaped table, with U.S. and Chinese officials seated on each side. Blinken's sitting position stood out as very different. So I guess my first question goes to Bill. So what's your take on this kind of sitting arrangement?
Well, I think Gordon Zhang has already pointed out on, I saw it on CNN, that this is a Chinese way of saying we're in unequal status. You are not as important as I am. I am the most important person at this table. Everybody else is subsidiary to me. So in the past, on occasion, Xi Jinping has met sitting alongside American officials. And in this case, it's obvious that he wants to say we are in unequal representatives. I am, after all, Xi Jinping, the leader of the great China, and you are just a minor official relative to me. And so, and also all of the other Chinese officials are also subordinate as
by
well.
The side,
Yeah. I think it's a fairly typical way of the Chinese signaling from the very start, even before discussions have begun, that the Chinese, in a sense, are superior, have an advantage over their counterparts from another country.
So what about you, Tony? Do you still think that this is equally an unequal way, even for American people, to treat their guests?
Well, this obviously is an optic thing. Xi Jinping wants to show the world, especially his people in China, that he assumes a more superior position. In 2018, when Secretary Pompeo visited, they sat side by side, demonstrating at that time there's more of a desire to have an equal dialogue. At this point, I think Xi Jinping want to make sure everybody understands he's going to dictate. He's going to dictate to Secretary Blinken from that position.
Okay, Yung-ming, would you kind of comment on this kind of interaction a bit?
I think there's also a domestic aspect we need to think about, because what happened in the last few years, especially the rising rivalry between U.S. and China, and also the pandemic and the Russian-Ukrainian war. So the whole situation, the security situation between global powers are very intense. So even if China wants to somewhat ameliorate a relationship between China and the United States, they still have to pretend a very strong stance to show its people, see, we are very strong, we are superior, and now the Americans, they are coming here to beg us to talk with them. So I think this kind of domestic aspect we need to think about.
Okay, so Tony, I actually wonder, if we can kind of speculate what Blinken was thinking about this kind of sitting arrangement. Did you think that he was well prepared for this kind of treatments ahead of time, or did you think that he might have some kind of plan B if this were happening? It did. Diplomatically, what's his mentality, Blinken's?
I fully expect Secretary Blinken was expecting this type of arrangement, just based on Xi Jinping's personality and behavior from recent times. So he fully understands, and I certainly believe so, that Xi Jinping will use this opportunity to demonstrate superiority. So I suspect that's expected.
Okay. Now let's talk about the whole U.S. China relations in a more broader context. So President Biden appears to be appeasing Xi Jinping, at least from this meeting between Blinken and Xi Jinping, and also other Chinese top officials, despite recent diplomatic and even military frictions. For instance, U.S. officials have discovered that China has had a spy base in Cuba for years. Additionally, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee passed the Ending China's Developing Nation Status Act unanimously. So despite China's vocal protest, so would you think that the tension between the United States and China eased from this point on after Blinken's visit, Bill?
I don't really feel that this particular meeting led to some sort of transformation in the relationship. I think that for the most part, Biden was under some pressure from friends and allies to try to improve the relationship. But in one sense, the meeting did not succeed because the main U.S. goal was to achieve direct military-to-military talks so they could avoid incidents at sea, incidents in the air, such as have recently occurred. And they didn't achieve that, despite 8 hours of talks between Blinken and his foreign ministry counterpart, and despite 2 hours of talks with Wang Yi, and despite the meeting with Xi Jinping. But I don't see any concrete results that have come out other than an agreement that they would go on talking. So I suppose from those people who are particularly worried about the relationship getting out of hand, this is a positive sign. But I don't see, objectively speaking, I don't see any concrete results myself out of this this meeting.
So would you say, Tony, that this meeting is gonna, leads to another, better probability, in Chinese perspective that there gotta be a meeting between President Biden and also President Xi? I
suspect they will have a chance to meet each other in APEC in November. However, Ambassador Stanton is absolutely right. There are fundamental differences between China and the United States and how the two countries sees the world. So, and the United States wants to reduce risk. And crisis communication is important for risk reduction, yet China is not wanting to do so. So, however, I suspect behind closed doors, Secretary Blinken must have made it clear to China on certain things that the United States expect, such as taking action, non-peaceful means against Taiwan, that United States China should expect United States will step in, and also some of the allies. Basically, United States is willing to give China the face in front of people, but behind closed doors, I suspect something that we use often, you speak softly but carry a big stick. I suspect that probably took place during those hours and hours of closed-door meetings.
This is a very interesting point because you mentioned the face kind of a favor given to China, because Chinese people, they do need this, right? But this is probably not as much as American culture. So, in the perspective of Blinken, he knows how to kind of manipulate, maybe in this way. Yung-ming, so, what's your evaluation of this, meeting? Does that indicate a better relationship between the United States and China?
Well, I agree with Bill and Tony, their comments regarding this meeting. Actually, I think it's just I would like to say it's just an interval between the long-term competition between the United States and the PRC. And I think it's a bipartisan consensus in the United States. There will be the competition with the China will be a marathon, and it will take decades for the final result to show. So it's impossible for you to remain a high tense phase during this marathon. There must be some relaxation period. So I think the Biden administration, they would like to enter into a somewhat relaxation phase. They try to do that, but we don't know if that can succeed or not. Well,
my next question would be kind of related to the first one is that sometimes we speculates what the Chinese officials will react to the external stimuli. But what about the United States? Because, for example, President Biden several times said that if there were a Taiwanese contingency, the U.S. Army would intervene. But after a while, State Department came out to say, no, the president doesn't mean that. Okay, so it appears that Biden wants to take a softer approach, or maybe harder approach, whereas his State Department, say otherwise. So Bill, would you kind of explain to our international audience, especially audience in Taiwan, that how are we able to view the whole interaction between the White House, the State Department, even the Defense Department?
And you also have to put in there the Congress, because I would say of all these players, the Congress is the most hard line, as has been suggested, with regard to China, the least willing to compromise on any principles or policies. So I think Biden, in my own view, President Biden tends to be an ameliorist. He wants things to get better. He's got an optimistic view on things, and I think it probably stems from the fact that he remembers the days when he was a counterpart as a vice president to Xi Jinping, and they were able to have a kind of a open discussion, and it was a friendlier type of an engagement. But I'm not sure that President Biden realizes that now that Xi Jinping is the supreme, he's a different person now who sees himself on a higher plane. So if he's only talking to a Secretary of State, there's a disparity in their perceptions of where they are. So I think there probably are disagreements. I think, as I said, the Congress is the toughest. I think there are people in the State Department, since the State Department's job is to negotiate, to talk, who probably want an easier path forward. And I think Biden probably also wants to satisfy, as I said, the friends and allies who are very worried about their trade relationship with China. So there are a lot of factors playing into this. But when it comes to the fundamental principle on Taiwan, I think Biden has made it, as you've indicated, 4 times he's basically said, if there is a all-out attack on Taiwan, the U.S. would have to intervene. And then his staff has come behind and said, but our policy on Taiwan has not changed. So there's room for ambiguity. I suppose you could say that's good diplomacy. The constant emphasis is we don't want to change the status quo. That's the one underlining principle that everybody says, is you can't change the situation by force in the Taiwan Strait. So I think Taiwan should take some comfort in that view. But I certainly would like to see more clarity myself in the U.S. position.
Okay. So Tony, is it appropriate to label the U.S.-China tensions as a new Cold War? Do you agree with this definition?
Actually, when we talk about Cold War, we're talking about political rivalries on two sides. When we talk about hot wars, that's when bombs and bullets are falling. We're in neither. I believe we are in a warm war, and let me explain why. In 1999, 2 Chinese military members, 2 colonels, wrote a book called Unrestricted Warfare. It talks about if China wants to attack the United States, China, you need to use all different means, including cyber, information warfare, the things that is traditionally military, done by military, but it emphasizes that unrestricted war needs to use non-military means. And also, it talks about there's the only rule about unrestricted war is there are no rules. Nothing is forbidden. If we look at the current cyber attack against both the United States and Taiwan and information warfare, where China is trying to tear our 2 societies apart. In the United States, we are getting more and more polarized, as in Taiwan, because there are a lot of fake informations. So that unrestricted warfare is going on right now. The problem is the world hasn't figured out when is that cyber attack an act of war? When is that information warfare, when the kind of damages that it's going to do becomes an act of war? So in a traditional sense, people are still waiting. Hey, we're not at war. Nobody has declared we're at war. But the fact is, China is at war with us right now. That's why I say it's a warm war. So the world needs to change our mindset about what is war. And because our democracies are at threat, China is, and Russia, they're using our freedom of speech, freedom of press against us to tear us apart. So China got a head start. They're doing it now. The rest of the world, I think we just need to get together and recognize that and do what we can to hedge, to try to push back, to prevent further successes and keep this under control, especially cyber.
Right,
You know, and also I think there need to be a declaration about at this point your cyber attack caused this kind of damage. It's an act of war. We're coming at you with everything, including missiles and bombs. So I think that's what the world needs, because we're under unrestricted warfare from China right now, both Taiwan and United States and other parts of democracies around the world. And the world just need to recognize it. So it's not a Cold War.
Right.
It's a warm war. It's
Right.
going on right now. It's like slowly cooking a frog. That China, you know, by the time you feel the heat,
It's
you
too
are
late.
cooked.
Yeah, it's too late. Well, especially after the ChatGPT came out and the AI actually assisted what you just mentioned, you know, in a very fast fashion, and that I think we all should get prepared. What about you, Yung-ming? You think that the Cold War now is a version 2.0, or is it something else like what Tony just suggested?
Yeah, I think Tony's comment is very interesting, and I kind of agree and disagree with Tony's opinion. If I remember correctly, the debate regarding the new Cold War surfaced in 2018, and during that time, many people, they just criticize this concept. They say, oh, it's kind of over-exaggerating, or it's just a terminological laziness to use the idea of Cold War. And they say during that time, or basically, we are when people are talking about the new Cold War, they are saying the revival of the competition between Russia and the United States. So it's during that time, it was a highly debatable issue. But after all these years, as I say, what happened in Hong Kong and the pandemic and the Russian-Ukrainian war and the rising rivalry between U.S. and China, now I think the situation is much more clear. China has become another superpower in the world, and it's clear that the cooperation between China and Russia, they have built up a bloc to counter the Western countries led by the United States. So this kind of situation is very clear. If we consider what happened after World War II, the first Cold War, Cold War 1.0, that's the comprehensive confrontation between the two nation blocs, one led by the Soviet Union and the other led by the United States. And the two blocs, they have very strong rivalry against each other, and they have all those confrontations in almost every aspect, almost every issue areas. The only thing we need to be happy about was that there was no direct military conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So that's why it's called the Cold War.
Okay.
And so if we think about the current situation, China now is the superpower, that's for sure, in terms of the national capabilities. And it has the intention to compete and even replace the United States. So I think it's appropriate to say, yes, it's the new Cold War. And I agree with what Tony's emphasis on the cyber warfare, because Cold War, it has no limits. It can compete in every aspect. So nowadays, even in the cyberspace, in those gray zone warfare, they are all included into this new Cold War 2.0.
Regardless, it is a Cold War or a tension only. I think when we talk about the two allies that going against each other, that'll be kind of a confrontation, a tension that requires some members to join each side, right? So we talk about now the third country, for example, Japan and South Korea. their relations to the United States is not only, their relations to China is not only political and military, but also economically. And by the same token, they need some kind of trades with China. So Japan and South Korea both host a significant number of U.S. military personnel, but also heavily rely on the Chinese markets for trade. So how are they managing to strike a balance between the military alliances and the economic dependence? Maybe, Bill?
Well, it's not very easy, but certainly I think in the past year or two, we've seen striking moves on the part of South Korea and Japan to strengthen their military relationship because of their fears of China. In the same way also, particularly after President Duterte stepped down in the Philippines has opened up more bases for the U.S. on a rotational basis, U.S. forces to use them. And there's also been more interaction between the Japanese and the Filipinos as well. And so I think these countries, as dependent as they may be on China, they're trying to continue to trade, but at the same time they're trying to build up their military capabilities with allies and ultimately, in a way, depending on the U.S. To strengthen them. And this is something I think the U.S. really welcomes, because in the past it was, for example, the South Koreans were not sharing their intelligence with the Japanese. And now they've reached an agreement to do that after, because of historical bitterness on the part of the Koreans toward the Japanese. So there has been a real improvement, I think, on the part of these allies in forging more of an alliance vis-à-vis China. So this is a positive development. I don't know if there's a real balance, other than that you have to say, as much as the Chinese might want to use trade as a weapon to get what they want from these countries, it's also a weapon that harms China if they don't continue to trade. So, there's a limit to what you can do with trade, particularly because China is one of the countries in the world most dependent on trade, exports itself. So it's a two-edged sword.
Okay. Earlier, we had a conversation with Dennis Weng, Associate Professor at the Sam Houston State University, regarding the United States' strategic position in relation to China and the potential shifts that might occur following Blinken's visit to China. Let's take a look.
Many U.S. China observers characterize the strain between the two countries as a modern equivalent to the Cold War. In your opinion, what aspect of China incites the most apprehension in the United States?
Well, I think indeed a lot of people worry about the Cold War again. The U.S.-China relation and tension is really escalated in recent years. However, I think both sides want to de-escalate the situation, so they take certain actions. But if we look into the reason why there's a second Cold War, it's because not only because of the military concern, but the economic concern as well. So both military and economic concerns significantly affect the U.S.-China relations. And the thing is, they are interrelated. Regarding military concern, I think U.S. is really worried about China's roles in Russia and Ukraine's war. And also U.S. worry about China's roles in North Korea as well. And China also has bring a huge threat to South China Sea. But among those threat situations, I think Taiwan is a flashing point. The U.S.-Taiwan has unofficial relations, but that unofficial relation really bothers China because China always claims Taiwan is part of China. So the Taiwan issue would be the key point regarding the U.S.-China relations. As we can see this time, Secretary Blinken visiting Beijing, one of the key issues, one of the major things they will be discussing will be the China issue. How U.S. try to talk about their one China policy, and how Beijing react to the traditional one China policy will be the point for us to observe. But for now, I can see the U.S.-China tension need to be de-escalated. Otherwise, we will be facing a very critical, very difficult 2024.
What alternative strategies could the United States employ to respond? Would China truly conform to U.S. directives given recent events, such as setting up an intelligence outpost in Cuba or flying surveillance balloons into American territory?
There are several strategies that the U.S. is taking now. First, strengthen the allies, the U.S. allies in Indo-Pacific. For instance, the U.S. strengthened the relationship with South Korea, with Japan, and also with Taiwan, Philippines, and Australia. Those are one of the key strategies that the U.S. is taking now. So if you ask me what's the alternative strategy, I would argue, like a National Security Advisor Jack Sullivan mentioned openly a couple times, the U.S. may take the so-called small yard and high fence. The small yard, small garden, high fence strategy means U.S. will focus on trying to protect the key essential core technology instead of protect all kinds of business. They will try to focus on the core advantage that the U.S. have now and build a high fence. The high fence regarding the trade relation, regarding the future U.S.-China relations, we can foresee there will be more trade restrictions on critical technology in the future. So the small yard high fence will be one of the alternative strategy regarding U.S.-China relation in the future. Militarily speaking, the U.S. will strengthen the allies in East Asia and also in Indo-Pacific region. But in trade, regarding trade relations, I think the U.S. will try to find a way to build high fence to protect the core technology. But at the same time, they will find a way to continue doing business with China, because don't forget the interdependence, the trade relations between U.S. and China in 2022 still over almost 700 billion. That's a huge number to U.S. and to China. So they will continue their doing trade, but at the same time, the U.S. will try to find a way to protect the core technology. But don't forget, Beijing will counter back. Beijing will take their strategy to push the U.S. Forward, to push U.S. and lift the restrictions very soon. So that's what we try to observe in this visit. Secretary Blinken visit Beijing. One of the observation would be what kind of strategy Beijing will be using to push or to force U.S. lift those restrictions.
Secretary Blinken has previously described the U.S. strategic stance against China as one of invest, align, and compete. In essence, the plan is to channel resources into technologies and infrastructures that could rival China, foster cohesion with allies who harbor similar objectives, and consequently leverage these elements to effectively compete with China. Do you envision any alterations to this strategy in the aftermath of Blinken's trip to Beijing?
If both U.S. and China would be willing to cooperate, then we will see some change, some alternative strategy maybe apply to the U.S.-China relation. For instance, the U.S. may some restrictions on technology, or the U.S. may reinforce or re-emphasize the so-called One China policy to kind of comfort Beijing. But if that's the case, Blinken or the President Biden will probably face a lot of pressure from Republicans in the U.S. So there's a lot of things to see, but I would argue we cannot assume the U.S. is still on the upper hand. Lots of things is not controlled by the U.S. side at this moment, because U.S. is relying on China. China also relies on the U.S. They need to find a way to negotiate, and they need to find a way to de-escalate the situation. Otherwise, the whole world will be facing a very challenging year.
Despite ongoing disagreements, as we just talked about from other guests, between the United States and China on various issues, including Taiwan, both countries have, at least from now we observe, initiated talks between their officials. So which side do you believe, the United States or China, first extended the alliance branch?
I believe both sides are willing to cool down bilateral tension. Mm-hmm. And the Biden administration has consistently emphasized the policy of competition rather than confrontation. Mm-hmm. In other words, while their overarching goal is to compete with China for global leadership, however, Washington is not keen to engage in immediate confrontations now. On the other hand, Beijing does not have the willingness to show its cards immediately either. However, due to national sentiment, I think Beijing must maintain a high posture, making it appear as if Washington is taking the initiative to extend an olive branch.
Okay, so for Tony, so some would argue that Xi Jinping, because of this new situation, has realized that it is impossible to directly confront the United States, given China's claim over Taiwan. They've been very insistent on this issue. So do you think that Xi Jinping needs to slightly back down? And we already see this meeting between Blinken and him, as a sign to maintain China's power, that he needs that to kind of back down. Maybe he can save his face on the one hand. On the other hand, he really can say something to his own people that I'm still tough. I can treat Blinken in this way, so I'm good.
Well, actually, I'm not convinced that Xi Jinping is recognize the impossibility of direct confrontation with the United States and associated allies who will come to Taiwan's aid, because he continues to tell his PLA to get ready for war. I mean, in the last 2 years, he has said so many times. And the danger is himself and the PLA start to believe their own propaganda, because they start to believe they're truly so good. The fact is they are very untested force, and they have no idea. Just compare the carriers. Their carriers so inferior to the U.S. capability, but yet they hype it up, say every time they come out, the U.S. carrier run away. That's domestically, they've been telling their own soldiers, their own people. So that kind of miscalculation is dangerous. They need a true net assessment, and unfortunately, Xi Jinping has removed any naysayers around him. He surrounded himself with the yes man. So this situation, like I said, I'm not convinced that he recognized the impossibility of challenging a coalition force led by the United States.
Just quick follow-up. What about Ukrainian war? Like particularly after reports of the Ukrainian army soon regaining control over the territories in eastern and also the southern Ukraine. Does that have any kind of implication for Xi Jinping?
I think he should understand the difficulty in conquering a people who is determined to defend themselves. That's number one. However, on the other side is Xi Jinping is just as determined to grab Taiwan by force if necessary. So peace through strength is what I always believed in. Deterrence. We must somehow make Xi Jinping understand that he can win, and even if he tried, the cost will be so high that he's going to lose his job. So at least we need to make him think this way for the foreseeable future until he goes away, because his ambition is there and it's not crunched, and he's going to continue to pursue that ambition of taking over Taiwan. So deterrence.
Okay. Speaking of deterrence, Bill, we speak of Taiwan. The U.S.-Taiwan military alliances continue to strengthen despite the evolving dynamic between the United States and China. So in May, for example, the U.S. authorized $500 million in arms aid for Taiwan. So do you think that should Taiwanese politicians and military officials be more outspoken, continue to be outspoken about China's aggression against Taiwan? Or do you think that we better maintain a low-key approach? That's better for Taiwanese people.
It's very hard to give advice to Taiwanese leaders, particularly since they often disagree among themselves. I mean, it's a democracy, as is the United States, so there's never a singular point of view. I think it is important, though, for whoever is in charge in Taiwan, whoever represents the Taiwanese people, to make it very clear over and over again, as not all of the current candidates for the presidency do, that clearly they support Taiwan's current status quo. They don't want that under any circumstance to change. They don't necessarily have to say we want to be independent, which is sort of a red flag. But I think they have to be very clear about what their view is. And I get, it's a matter of concern to me when I see there are some whether welcoming Coast Guard, PRC Coast Guard vessels to visit in Penghu to look around, or whether I see other people when I hear about people who are taking a very benign attitude toward visitors coming from China, or fostering visits to go to China. These are matters of concern, because I think basically, the Taiwanese people need to recognize that China just wants to control Taiwan, wants to take it over.
Yeah.
And so there are certain red lines that I don't think people should be crossing.
Okay, so Yung-ming, I think Bill made a great point that it's really efforts. I mean, the burden should be on the Taiwanese society, especially politicians. So how significant do you think that the future Taiwan's presidents, there will be an ongoing election next year, either candidates from DPP, KMT, or third party, impact the U.S.-Taiwan relations? What's your assessment of this?
Well, although I'm Taiwanese, but I'm not an expert on Taiwanese politics. Yeah, but okay, I will just give a try. Currently, I don't believe that the future president of Taiwan will have a significant impact on U.S.-Taiwan relations because they are all somewhat conditioned by the large structure. Yeah, so basically, I think all candidates, they claim to be pro-U.S., pro-America. And so the influencing factors lie in their stance on cross-strait relations. If we look at DPP, Vice President William Lai, he had a record of the pro-independence in the past. But I think it's highly impossible for us to expect that he will change President Tsai Ing-wen's legacy on cross-strait relations once elected. And in terms of Taiwan People's Party, TPP, it's true that Mayor Cohen's, he made a lot of comments. He mentioned about equal distant diplomacy. He mentioned he warned the over-reliance on the United States, all these kind of statements. But if you look at their party white paper, actually there's no much difference between TPP and DPP. They still highlight, yes, U.S. is our important ally, and we need to emphasize the autonomy of Taiwan. And finally, KMT may appear to be closer to Beijing on the spectrum. But if you want to win the election, you must adjust. It's pure electoral considerations. So generally, New Taipei City Mayor Hou You-yi, he also have to make a statement that we need to defend Taiwan and we need to enhance our military build-up, all those kind of promises. So in summary, the positions of all three candidates, they are actually similar rather than different, despite occasional rhetoric mentioned or made to attract voters.
Right. We talked about the situation in Taiwan's presidential election. Now we kind of move back to the Blinken's visit to China. I guess the question goes to Bill. When Blinken met with the Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang, who even expressed the possibility of visiting the United States in the near future, was this meeting between Blinken and Qin Gang substantively helpful in easing the tension between the two countries? Well,
talk is always helpful, I suppose. But we have to understand that a Chinese foreign minister is never going to be separated in his views, never express different views from those of Xi Jinping. So whatever Qin Gang had to say to Blinken, I don't think we can expect anything much different. So he will be working within tight guidelines. If he wants to visit the United States, sure, that's a positive development. He certainly smiles more often than Wang Yi, who I remember when he was...
Alaska meeting, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember Wang Yi when we used to call on him. He was in charge of Southeast Asian relations, and we both wanted the Vietnamese to get out of Cambodia. He was a little bit friendlier because we had a like-minded view on that, but he rarely smiles about anything, even less than Xi Jinping. So, Qin Gang is probably a more benevolent representative of China, so it might win a little bit of support when he goes to the U.S. But I don't think, more engagement is a good idea, but I don't expect anything dramatic to come out of that kind of a visit. Fundamentally, we have such deep disagreements over Taiwan, over trade, over intellectual property protection, over every issue you can think of. And also one thing we haven't mentioned is China right now is so constrained by its own problems, which people sometimes forget. I mean, they have a terrible youth unemployment problem. It's now 20.7%, I think, unemployed college graduates. They have a debt problem. They, overbuilt housing. These ghost cities have expanded. They also have these trade problems now, because the United States is beginning to say, hey, we're not going to let you have access to our intellectual property because you steal it. So I think China has a number of issues economically, domestically. Overall, they have a big demographic problem because their population is dropping because the One China policy was such a disaster. And in fact, I knew when I went on a tour of the Yangtze River once, which was all designed by the Foreign Ministry to let us stop at each village and see how successful one-child policy was. I remember talking to a State Department demographer back in Washington who said this was going to be a disaster because you could project into the years ahead that there was going to be a real drop-off in population as a result.
Speaking of disaster, not trying to disagree with you, but the question goes to Tony. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen issued a warning stating decoupling the U.S. and China economically would be a disaster, as you just mentioned. So what's your take on this? From the American perspective, if the Cold War mentality persists, which of the two major economies will suffer more, you think?
Actually, now the term is de-risking.
Okay.
Right? So what are the risks? Intellectual properties, high technology being stolen and be used for weaponry. So this is a type of control that international, it's just not United States, but it's an international effort to limit transfer of these high technology items to China. So what economically, I think more damage will come to China because China depends so much on foreign investment, foreign factories, and without these type of things, what do they produce? So unemployment rate, we talk about the youth unemployment rate, you can almost foresee further unemployment at a different level of different group of people as these plants decide to move out of China because they cannot use this technology to produce new stuff to compete. So the big company might move these factories to Vietnam, to Philippines, where it's still competitive and they can use those technologies to manufacture stuff to sell to the world. So I think overall, China will hurt more, and they need to look at this. They need to start becoming more responsible stakeholder, follow the rule-based world so that they can continue to survive, because trying to impose China's rule is not going to work.
Well, I mean, I would be wondering if you say so, that President Xi Jinping would say, "Oh, we got a great, enormous market to digest the products from the Western companies." And how would you respond to this kind of?
Yeah, they do have a huge market, and people should sell stuff to China and get their money, but
and then leave.
Right, because 50 years ago, China can produce so much because the domestic market can sustain itself. Okay, it's no longer so. The Chinese consumer got used to certain niceties that has to be imported.
Right.
And if you look at China's foreign reserve, okay, China's foreign reserve allow it to last about 11 and a half months, for example. Taiwan actually has sufficient foreign reserve to last like 18 months. So actually, Taiwan financially is stronger to China. So that shows that China's dependency on imports. Can they continue to sustain itself as a country without imports? Well, I'm not sure.
Right, that's a great point. What about you, Yung-ming? Decoupling hurts United States more or China more?
I agree with Tony's comment. I think China will suffer more, and I think that's why I expect Qin Gang will visit United States for further negotiations, because currently there are a lot of sanctions imposed by United States over China regarding intellectual property rights and high-tech technology transferring. all those kind of stuff can have a strong impact on Chinese economy. And the China cannot upgrade their industrial production, and Xi Jinping claimed to reach the goal of the China made 2025, right? And they want to become the leader of the high-tech production, but that kind of dream has gone. So I think China has the desire to act to demand United States to remove those kind of sanctions. Of course, the U.S. will suffer because during the post-Cold War years, the United States actually rely on China to offer those cheap products in our store. We all have those kind of experience. Everything is made in China. So if there is a decoupling between United States and China, I think the lower and the middle class in the United States will suffer. And however, Chinese society will suffer more compared with the U.S.
Yeah. So Bill, I wonder, what's your prediction of the future relationship between the United States and China under the next U.S. president?
Yeah, well, we don't know who the next U.S. president is, and there's a lot of concerns now that all of the candidates have real drawbacks. Trump, of course, is under indictment, more than one. He's got huge legal problems. Everybody's worried about President Biden's age. And
what about Ron DeSantis?
Ron DeSantis doesn't seem to have much public support, and he's not identified with foreign policies. Particularly, he's identified with anti-wokeism. Okay. He's concerned with issues like gender change and this kind of stuff, which is really frivolous relative to the big issues that the United States faces. So whoever's elected, though, I think the problems that we have with China are systemic. They're system-based. One is a communist country, dictatorship, authoritarian state. The other is a democracy. Never the twain will meet. It's very difficult. It's always going to be systemically a difficult relationship between the two countries. I think who's ever elected, we can expect to see probably the same kind of situation we now have.
That's great. In this episode, we explore the intricate geopolitical landscapes shaped by the escalating rivalry between the United States and China, which pose both opportunities and challenges for nations like Taiwan, the Philippines, Korea, and Japan. Striking a balance in these dynamics and managing potential conflicts is of utmost importance, particularly for Taiwan in light of China's territorial ambition. In this new era of great power competition, preserving national interests become a significant challenge for Taiwan. Did you enjoy this episode? We would love to hear your thoughts. So please leave a comment on our YouTube channel and do not forget to hit the subscribe button. Take care until next time.